friends, this is Trish, and welcome to Teacher Therapy. Today we have a very special guest named Mr. G, and he taught high school in Chicago for 11 years. And he's going to talk to us today about how educational philosophy is missing the mark and how magical thinking has taken over education. But before we get there, Mr. G, I'd love to just hear what got you interested in becoming a teacher.
Well, I come from a family of educators, 4 generations. My father was a teacher and then a administrator. My mother was a teacher. A lot of my aunts and uncles were teachers, so it was kind of in the blood, so to speak. And but first and foremost, I had a very positive experience in school. I always saw going to school as something to look forward to. It was a safe space, so to speak. It was a place where magical things seemed to happen. So I originally, when I left my bachelor's program at Michigan State, my original intention was to go and teach at the university level, but that desire to be in a classroom and to do the teaching aspect of it, as opposed to the research aspect, took me away from graduate school and back into a teacher training program. And so I ended up going back, into the classroom, but in a different capacity. So I wanted to reproduce the wonderful things that I experienced. Of course, I learned many years later that many people, for many different reasons, have very negative experiences in schools. For some kids, schools are a magical place. For other places, it is torturous. And that took me a while to get my head around, to realize that there's a spectrum of ways people think about schools. And I think some of the parents out there right now who are helicopter or bulldozer parents, whatever you want to call them, I think they maybe had some of those extremely traumatic experiences. And now they view schools that way. So they are overtly protective of their children because they feel like I was never protected when I was in school. And for me, I dreaded going to school every single day. I think that discrepancy in how people view education as an experience and what its meanings are has now translated into how parents are thinking about how their kids should also view education.
That makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's very gracious to kind of attribute well-meaning for parents that are sometimes driving teachers crazy, because a lot of times their concerns are valid, as we'll probably hear about later in this interview. So I'm just kind of curious, when you went into your teacher education program, did you feel like it prepared you well? Did you enjoy it? What was that experience like?
So the teacher education program, looking back at it, I'm trying to not be emotional about this. I would say I definitely took away from it many things that would be on the here's what not to do list. Here is what it shouldn't be. Here is what should not be happening. I was very disillusioned when I went back and I got my teaching licensure in Michigan in 2007. It was a 2-year program for people who had already left school and they wanted to come back and get their licensure. And in sitting there and listening to the things that were coming out of the graduate students' mouths or some of the professors, it concerned me that very idealistic promises were being asserted, despite the fact that there were these huge practical barriers in the way. The very first week of the program, the professor that I had for introduction to learning, or whatever the course was titled, he was it was his first year out of a PhD program, and I was shocked to learn that he only had 3 years of teaching experience himself. And then the graduate students running the other classes, they would say, "Oh yeah, I taught for 1 year, and then I entered this program." And I'm looking at all of these people who are either certified to be experts or in the process of being certified. And I thought to myself, but you've had so little classroom experience. One of the graduate students, we openly asked him, why did you leave after 2 years? And he said, well, I wanted to be part of a broader discussion. And the reality of it is many of these people got very quickly burned out. They wanted the heck out. They didn't know what else to do. I'll comment later on why too many of those people end up in administration. But you should spend a certain number of years in the trenches, so to speak, in the classroom, learning about students, their learning needs, the parents, et cetera, et cetera. But I get into this graduate program, and this professor is making these very wild assertions. The first one that comes to mind is that if you adapt your teaching to the learning style and need of any child, then that child will learn and they will blossom and they will prosper. So I'm sitting there and I raised my hand amongst others. I said, but what do you do if you have a kid that has all of these socioeconomic barriers at home? What happens if they come into your class as a ninth grader and they have a fifth grade reading level? You've basically just made the promise that all the teacher has to do is change what they're doing, differentiating the instruction, and it will happen. It's like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And I remember thinking that's when the term magical thinking came. I'm like, these are magical promises. What are you gonna put on the ruby red slippers and click them 3 times and you go back to Kansas? And so I ended up developing, he saw me as like a thorn in his side because I was always there to raise my hand and say, wait, hold on. You've just made this like incredible, idealistic, emotional promise. And I'm sitting here as the pragmatic realist saying, listen, I hear you. There is enormous discrepancies. There are enormous inequities. However, we can't dream this, out of existence. We have to look at what is actually, meet the kids where they are, meet people where they are, as President Obama said, and then work with them. So, but in the 2 years of that program, getting my licensure, I was so disillusioned that the people who seemed to be the experts, the people at the top, the people who were writing books, the people who were going to lectures, the people who were going down the street to the Michigan Capitol in Lansing and testifying to the governor and other policymakers and saying, here is what should be done. It seemed like these people were like living in an ivory tower where their practical experiences in the classroom seemed so minimal. Even the principal at the school where I did my student teaching experience had only taught for 3 years, and he had been in a classroom in 22 years. And just listening to him talk about, well, here's what a teacher is supposed to be doing, here's how a student is supposed to be learning, it seemed so out of sync. And there seemed to be so many promises made to these bright-eyed young people, because I was about 5 years older than them, and they were being led to believe you're gonna do incredible things. You're gonna save lives. These kids are gonna get out of poverty by way of what you're doing in the classroom. And I'm just sitting here listening to this like, oh my God, like we should absolutely be part of that mission to fight poverty, to fight inequality. But you're not going to do it on your own, kid. Don't believe that because you taught this kid about the Peloponnesian War that it's gonna offshoot the realities that are going on at home. So that's when I started believing that the people who were running education, the people who were sort of behind the steering wheel, were like in a fantasy land, and that we had lost touch with realism and pragmatism in the pursuit of an ideal kind of emotional, we're going to create a perfect world, we're going to get it done. And if it fails, it's not us, it's the system or whatever.
You just completely described my entire Teach for America experience. It was like that on steroids. And the crazy thing about that is in Teach for America, basically you only have to teach for 2 years and then you can apply to be an MTLD, which was like manager of teacher leader development experience. So it's like the entire organization is made up of all of these people that maybe taught for 2 years. We kind of got fast tracked a master's degree during night classes. And really, for all intents and purposes, like have no idea what we're doing, and discovered being in the classroom for 2 years that it was terrible. And those were the people telling us, the big catchline is one day all children will. If you just do these 5 things, it's going to work. And we would try to talk in our like really long Saturday sessions that would sometimes be like 8 hours long and say, okay, this kid through a chair, what do we do? And they would say some kind of buzzword like, did you have high expectations? Did they understand what you were looking for? And it was so much of the same thing. And it was just so much guilt put upon the teachers too. We just felt so horrible that, we're idealists wanting to help kids in poverty and help to change their future, yet we're not being given the skills, because in reality, no teacher really can do that for the most part.
Absolutely. And if you do push back, and I did do this, so this was the reaction that I got. If you push back and say, listen, we can't do everything, okay? There's a basic law of quantity versus quality. If you increase the quantity, you will decrease the quality. And over the last 25 years, They've been asking teachers to do more and more and more and more. And what you're going to get is you're going to get a decrease in the quality. The teacher is going to feel like the job satisfaction is decreasing. The depth of what you're able to get through in terms of content and skills and enduring understanding, et cetera, all the buzzwords, that's going to decrease. So, we're constantly on this teeter-totter. If you go back to No Child Left Behind in 2001/2002, they ramped up the quantity, especially with standardized testing. We're going to test more. We have to gather data and we need to track it. And I feel like we're treating some of these students like some sort of crop of tomatoes in California that's being produced. Well, this year's crop is 5% larger than last year's. That's progress. How can we get the same output with 5% less water? And these are human beings here, okay? They are not inanimate objects. They are human beings. They have distinct personal experiences. They're going to have distinct personal reactions, distinct personal motivations. And we've increasingly standardized teaching, while at the same time, we're giving lip service to differentiation and diversity and equity and all these other things. And it's like, you can't have both. Okay. And they go, going back to just to add another comment on the student teaching experience, going back and looking at, my mentor teacher and the principal of the school and the other people, I was never able to be comfortable with the reality that over the last 30 odd years, the people who are getting into administration and into colleges of ed, professors of ed, increasingly, they have less and less practical experience. Could you imagine going into a hospital and someone is in charge of a surgical procedure and it's like, don't worry, I had 8 months of trial and error. And it's like, you want someone who's had thousands of hours, okay? The whole concept of someone becoming a master at something is 10,000 hours? I remember a time when my father was an administrator, my grandfather was an administrator, but they were teachers for at least 10, 15 years, and then they went into administration. The superintendent was someone who had been a teacher for many years and then was a principal for many years. Now I'm hearing stories, I don't live in Michigan or Chicago anymore, but I'm hearing stories about, oh, did you hear about so-and-so? He's now assistant superintendent for curriculum. And it's like, he taught for 1 year at an elementary, and then for 3 years as an assistant principal and 1 year as a principal. And now he's a superintendent. How is that possible? How can we allow that to happen? And then these people turn around and they evaluate the people in the classroom. And you could just tell, and everyone who's watching this, put it in the comments. How many times have you had an instance where you're like, you are evaluating me, you are incompetent, okay? I think that is a major problem in the profession that is not being addressed, is the leadership at the top qualified to be leading.
That is so true. And you mentioned to me beforehand that you had an interesting experience with a professor that kind of threatened to fail you for the class. Could you tell the audience a little bit about that story?
So yeah, absolutely. So at the end of the student teaching experience, so you would be in a high school for 4 days of the week. And on the 5th day, we'd all meet in East Lansing for the program. And we would have a series of morning and afternoon classes. And we had to do this large reflection paper. And I wrote mine on pragmatism, that, the promises that are being made and the things that are believed in are increasingly growing further apart because of these economic issues and I used the school as a case study of here is why this school, the principal and the school board are making these promises to the community. However, based on the last 9 to 10 months worth of observation, because through the Michigan State program, it's a year-long teacher ed program, which I actually think is a good thing that everyone should do, a full year. But I wrote mine on it is unlikely that the promises made by the district are going to be able to happen because, and I cited 3 things, like there's this was at the time of the Great Recession. There's growing unemployment within the district. The GM shut down a plant. A variety of plants laid off half their staff. So I itemized it and I said, these things that are happening at the socioeconomic level, at the policy level, that are outside of the school's control, these are going to work against what the school is trying to accomplish. And I wasn't blaming the school and saying, yeah, the leadership is too stupid or they're too naive or whatever. I was trying to write something that was scholarly as best you can as a student teacher. So the graduate student running the class, he said, you can't write this. This is negative against the school. I said, well, it's not against the school. I'm just saying they're not going to be able to likely accomplish these things. And he's like, but our objective as educators is to transform lives. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. And however, at the same time, there's going to be a lot of things in our way. And we also have to be realistic. Are we, are we dreaming too much of this? Is it feasible? Or can we get it done, but it's going to take like 10 to 20 years? And he said, you don't have evidence that they won't be able to accomplish all of these things. And I said, one of their objectives is to get kids who are moving into the district who have a 5th or 6th grade reading level and get them up to 11th or 12th grade. And I said that you're not going to do that. You're not going to jump 5 to 6 years worth of their literacy abilities, their writing abilities. That's not realistic. And he kept saying, you don't know that they can't do that. It's our mission. Don't you remember what we read in Dewey? And I was like, oh my God, they're talking about John Dewey again. As if he's like this icon. And I said, listen, did you actually read my full, paper and everything? And he said, well, I can't accept this because it's critical of the school. It's basically saying that they weren't smart enough to realize that they wouldn't be able, and you're going to have to rewrite it. This is supposed to be positive. And I said, well, so you want me to lie? You want me to just fabricate something? Well, no, I didn't say that. But the whole purpose of the student teaching experience is that we're transforming. He gave me all the jargon. We're supposed to be transforming lives. We're supposed to be contributing to building a better world. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. But we need to understand what the hurdles are. So he flatly told me, like, well, I'm gonna have to give this a 0 because it doesn't conform to the standards of the rubric. And the standards of the rubric really did want us to write something that was overtly positive. And long story short, I ended up going to the dean, and I said, this is a violation of my academic freedom. Here's what I wrote, and I backed it up. And the dean then stepped in and told the head of the College of Education, like, I don't see why this cannot be accepted. It certainly was not expected, but and the dean was a former professor of sociology. And so she said, I take issue with the fact that you're requiring a student to write something that is entirely positive. And so long story short, they got another professor to grade it and review it, and it was accepted. But that graduate student, by the way, is the one who had only taught for 2 years doing middle school language arts. And then he got disillusioned with it. And he was like, I wanted to be part of a broader dialogue or whatever. And I followed that guy up through social media. He's not even in academia anymore. So, but I've heard horror stories about teacher ed programs, and that some of them are just so ineffective. And I wonder if the people in those programs, if there just is not a balance between people who view the world more cautiously or more pragmatically or more realistically, and if it's just dominated by sort of these emotive, like, we have to save the children, we have to do everything possible. And it's like, we certainly, and these are one of the discussions I remember from student teaching. It's like, hell yes, I agree with you. We have enormous problems in our society, but you're not going to cry and emotion your way out of it. We need to have very difficult and very serious discussions, and they never wanted to have that. They always referred to me by a variety of the guy who's always negative, and he doesn't believe in children. He doesn't believe in progress and all these other things. And I was like, no, I do, but I'm a pragmatic idealist. I do want a better world, but we have to have that honest conversation. What is going on immediately in front of us? Can we actually get this done? Is this realistic? So yeah, and it was for the variety of these reasons why when I went back to graduate school and I got a master's, I did not do it in education. I got it in history. I absolutely refused to go and get a graduate degree in education just because of the domination of that sort of group think. That sort of if you have any inkling that this isn't going to work or whatever, you're now outside of our bubble. And you're the antithesis of what we're trying to do. I mean, it's a very binary way of looking at the world, but thus is the world we live in right now.
I'm with you 100%. And I think I really look at the world the same way. And my big beef with education when I was a teacher for 8 years was the fact that the very things that were required to truly see growth, we weren't allowed to do. We had to dumb down everything. We had to turn everything into a game. We had to make everything hyper palatable and really, really entertaining. We couldn't have standards where we required students to do homework. We ended up getting rid of grades altogether. Basically, everything that you would have to do to truly create those gains in growth that I really do believe it is possible, but it requires an enormous amount of work, really high standards, community and family buy-in, and the kid has got to show some grit at some point and stop being babied. And I was kind of really viewed the same way whenever I would bring up these things. It's kind of going back to your point of magical thinking. It's just like, no, if you entertain them enough by osmosis, the information will get into their head and they're going to succeed in life. And it was just the disconnect was so crazy. And so once you finally got into the classroom, how did the reality of teaching differ from your expectations? And what are some of the run-ins you started having with administration?
So for the record, I taught at a magnet high school within Chicago Public Schools. I overwhelmingly had positive experiences with students. Chicago Public Schools has this magnet system called selective enrollment, where the students have to apply to get in. So it's almost like applying to a private school. They have to have certain test scores with math and reading and writing. They can't have any behavioral issues. They have an attendance report, and all these things are taken into consideration. So I did not serve what might be considered a typical high schooler in Chicago Public Schools. It was definitely a pampered bubble. It was a wonderful pampered bubble, but the run-ins and the headaches and the sort of like Sunday dreads or Sunday scaries is what I think people are calling it, was not as much related to the students or even a lot of the parents, but it was the administration, and it was the people from downtown. I learned very quickly that, again, going back to are the people in charge? Should they be in charge? I learned very quickly that the principal of my school could very easily be manipulated. This principal had only been a teacher for about 3 or 4 years. So think about that. They never earned tenure. Okay. And there was an incident that happened like 2018, 2019. And I was teaching advanced placement world history with another colleague. And looking back, I'm still not sure if this was like a prank, because the students like to make false accusations and see if the principal would fall for it, or if this was genuine. Yeah. So I get called down with a colleague. We both were teaching this AP world class, and the principal said, "I've had a complaint from a student that all social and cultural and identity groups are not being represented in your class." And we're like, okay, well, what is the specific complaint? And the complaint was in regards to we were getting to the Second World War, and there was a standard on like how technology made the war so horribly destructive. Why 70 million people died in the Second World War. And just as an illustrative example, we showed like a 4-minute clip from Saving Private Ryan. Have you ever seen that movie, Saving Private Ryan?
No.
Okay. So the very beginning of it, it's by Steven Spielberg. The very beginning of it is very graphic. And we're not showing it because we're sort of like, I don't know what to do today. Oh, let's pop in a video. Because, hey, we all know some of us have had those history teachers where they're like, okay, we're going to watch another video. And we only showed the 4-minute clip. And then we had a discussion afterwards about like, the thing to remember here is that with history, yes, these things happened in 1944, but just imagine how messed up or traumatized so many of these people were. Like that's what's called a legacy, because we were trying to illustrate to the students what a legacy is, and that legacy can exist up here psychologically. And so the principal said, well, the student complained that in this clip, there were no persons of color, there were no women, there were no people who were not cis male or cisgendered. And it just there was an entire list of like, I didn't see this, I didn't say this, I didn't see this, and we said, well, for the record, this is a very historically accurate scene. Historians have looked over this, and in June of 1944 in northern France, it's going to be all men. Women were not allowed to fight. Yes, there was segregation in the army. And I said to the principal, and we can and we do talk about those things. Why is it that it was all white males on that beach, on the German side and on the American side? And then I also pointed out, I said, and in 1944, no one was identifying as like cis this or trans male, whatever. And I said to the principal, that just it didn't exist at the time. And so the principal said, well, but the students deserve to see themselves in the history. And we said, yes. And that eventually happens when we get like to the 60s and 70s. But in this one single example, we were like, you're not going to get that. It's just, it's not realistic. Okay. It's sort of like saying, well, we shouldn't teach Martin Luther King because there wasn't an Asian American sitting at that decision-making table. There should have been East Asian American representation at that table. So anyway, long story short, so the principal said, well, from now on, I want full representation of all groups in all of your illustrated examples. And I'm sitting there like this. I'm like, oh, and I didn't have tenure yet. I was still a year away. I'm like, I'm not going to argue with her. Now, my colleague did. And he just kind of looks up like this and he's like, so let me ask you a question. So let's say I'm teaching about the Declaration of Independence, okay? And we're talking about the debates that were going on. And yeah, it's a group of elderly, they're all fluent, so rich white men. And what, do you not want us to teach that because there were no Latinos present at that discussion? And the principal just sort of like looks up and says like, oh, well, I didn't major in history, but it sounds like if you can't find full representation of all groups, you should just not teach the topic. And he said, so we should not teach the debates surrounding the Constitution, surrounding the Declaration of Independence, because there wasn't full representation of groups. And the principal said, well, yeah, it doesn't sound like it's an equitable topic.
That's insane.
Oh, yeah. That's, in this profession, you have these, like, I call them gems. It's like these bizarre stories from that students say, or parents say, or administrators. That's one of my gems. I'm like, that's an administrative gem right there. So we ended up ignoring her and went on. But I've heard other stories of like, administrators who just, they have so little content experience or just practical social experience in the classroom that they end up making things worse. And what makes things worse on top of that is that when students and parents figure out that the administration can be manipulated because they don't have that backbone. I mean, think about a teacher who's been in the classroom for like 25 years. It's like a really sturdy house that is sunken in already. And it's like, man, that's a sturdy house. So many of these administrators now, they got scared out of the classroom. They didn't know what else to do. That they're like, I can't handle this anymore, but I don't think I could go into another profession. Oh, wait, I'll go into a college of ed and I'll become a professor, or I'll become an administrator. My last year teaching for Chicago Public Schools, the top 3 administrators combined had 9 years of experience. And the last time one of them was in the classroom was 2006. And I just left the classroom in June of 2024. So think about that. How can you lead a school and the 3 of you have 9 years of experience and the youngest of you was last in the classroom before smartphones, before Barack Obama, before like 2006, you hear that and you're just like, wow, what a failure of leadership. So that's definitely an area I think that we need to go after. Is like, how can you become an administrator with only a couple years experience? There are a couple states, I looked this up. There are a couple states where there are laws where it says you cannot apply for administrative license until you have at least so many years of experience. Those states are in the minority. Many states have no such requirement, but I think it should be. There's a lot of issues going on in education, and I mean that's an understatement. But one of them needs to be like, who's able to get to the top, and how quickly are they able to get there? Because I am not entirely convinced that all the problems that are going on are just because of apathetic students and crazy parents. I see this like from a 360 perspective. We also have to look at like who's running the schools, who's getting onto the school boards, who's sitting in the ivory tower colleges of ed who are making these huge promises to bright-eyed 20-something-year-olds, and then they very quickly become disillusioned and like, wait a minute, I was told that it was going to be A, B, and C, but it's now X, Y, and Z, and they go into like an existential crisis, and maybe I'm at fault or whatever, and now I want to leave the profession because I'm not able to live up to what was modeled to me in the colleges of ed. So anyway.
Yeah, and it reminds me too, I found out a few years back that a neighboring district's superintendent made $400,000 a year. And a lot of the administrators were making six figures. And I know that for my state, it wouldn't be completely uncommon to start off as a teacher between $32,000 and $36,000. So I think that most of us don't want to think about this, but maybe people are being drawn into admin for some of the wrong reasons to begin with. They kind of see it as what they perceive to be quick, easy money. And so maybe they don't have the same heart, so to speak, as the average teacher does, truly for kids, truly for education, truly for learning. They're just seeing dollar bills and they're thinking, I don't have to be a doctor or a lawyer. I can make insane money by, going up the tracks in admin.
Yeah. And there, again, I've heard stories about that as well. So, my family members who went into administration back in the late 60s and 70s. Now, this was at a time where teachers were more poorly unionized. And some of them said, I liked being in the classroom. I just couldn't raise three kids on a teacher salary. And so reluctantly, I went into administration just for the money, but I never really wanted to do it. I think that there are those, but then there are also those who are like, oh God, I shouldn't have done this. This was the wrong profession. Oh wait, I'll go into administration and I won't have to deal with 140 kids on a day-to-day basis. And but then they have these responsibilities that are premised on the idea that you've been in the classroom a really long time and that you believed in what could happen in the classroom. And so those people end up creating a toxic environment because you can kind of sense in them that, and I've had assistant principals like this where you can sense that like, man, they are really miserable and they weren't happy in the classroom and they're not happy in the front office. And, these are just people who should have exited the profession altogether. We should have people leading the profession who are masters in their content, master teachers. I had this before, before we have this meeting here, I had a conversation with a friend back in Chicago who's in the military. And he said, I don't understand why you guys in the education field don't have like a rank system where you have, because even in the colleges, you have assistant professors, associate professors, and then you have like full professors. He's like, why don't you guys have like intro level assistant teacher? And then you have an associate teacher, and then you have a full teacher. And like in the military, because he thinks about things in military ways, he's like, you start out here and through merit, you work your way up through the system. And I said, yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. I mean, it'd be nice if we had some sort of structure where that maybe that brought authority or respect or whatever, but we don't. And we're never going to make tangible changes until we look at who's in the front office and what are they doing. And don't get me wrong, there are competent, hardworking people who are running schools, but there are also a lot that should never have been allowed to become an administrator. And we have to figure out how do we get these people out, and what conditions do we create for the future where we say you are not going to become an administrator unless you have attained certain prerequisites. And that is not going to guarantee that they'll be an effective administrator. You could still get someone who ends up being a dictator, but at the very least they need to have certain experiences in the classroom. And we aren't doing that. It's too easy to get to the top, and it's so difficult for us to stay at the bottom. And by that I mean in the classroom. more and more people are fleeing the profession. And every time one of us flees, the people in the front office are just sort of like, well, that's one less, thorn in my side. And they get all excited. I've seen this. Someone who spoke out against the administration or spoke out against the students, they just got sick of it and they left. And the administrators would be celebrating. Oh, we got rid of her. Well, let's hire someone else. And typically they hire people who are very sheepish, sort of like, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, and obedient. And that's a major change I've seen in the last 15 years is that more and more of the people becoming administrators have less and less experience. And the people who are staying longer and kind of putting up with it are the type of personalities who just sort of like, well, whatever. They're willing to accept being treated a certain way, maybe out of economic desperation. Maybe they don't know how to stand up for themselves. But in my last year, I saw a lot of the more assertive personalities, the type of people who would stand up and say, I'm not going to let you treat me this way. And I'm not going to let you treat the other members of this department that way either. Those people just say, I can't deal with it. I want out. And the people who replace them are very good subordinates.
That makes a lot of sense. And even just thinking back to the administration discussion, sometimes there's been a few instances where I had a really awesome building principal, but they were basically battling district admin every step of the way because the district administrators and decision makers were the ones that were choosing the curriculum. They were choosing the mandates for the school. They were choosing the policies and the rules. And it was almost like the principal had to be sandwiched in between the teachers and the district and trying to kind of filter it through. And so I do have some compassion for the good administrators that are really trying to fight for their teachers, but they're just being pressured and controlled by district admin. So it just seems like this top-down disaster that there's just so many problems all the way up to lawmakers and legislators who have never been teachers that are making the broader rules and kind of giving them to the districts and so on and so forth. So it is, I think, a really tricky problem for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we look at what is going on in education, we have to address two things. First, there are problems coming at us from within the profession, but also outside the profession. So outside the profession would be the lawmakers, the policy folk, whatever, who don't know what they're talking about. I would also say, people have like a social or ideological agenda. So we're being attacked from outside the walls, but then we're being attacked from inside the walls because, you have the administrators who don't know what they're doing, or they have an agenda, or they're trying to build up this is something I started to see a lot in the last 10 years. They build up their resume by being able to say, oh, in the last 5 years, student reading has grown by 26%. And they add all these little gold stars to their resume. And then what do? They jump ship for another district where they'll get a $15,000 pay increase. So they basically use the school as a resume builder. They don't care about the students. They don't care about the teachers. They just care about, I want to add this to my resume and be able to say, I got, because of me, not the teachers, not the students, not anyone, because of me, we got this done, we got this done, we got this done, and this is why you should hire me, and I should, get paid more. So we have those two elements, the internal problems and the external problems. And then within each of those, you have things coming at us from the bottom and things coming at us from the top. So it's like 4 different directions here. And that's why, in meeting with you today, and I wanted to address some of the things that I hadn't seen in your other videos. We talk a lot about the apathetic student. We talk a lot about the crazy parent, and they do exist. But things are coming at us from 360 degrees, and we have to have a broader field of vision here and understanding, like, when you turn around to address this issue, something's going to stab you in the back.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you with a lot of the misguided social justice practices. That is its own video probably, but that is a huge mess. And I think especially for, schools that are, low socioeconomic status, basically not the majority race, it's really hard because I think that those kids are being the most disenfranchised by a lot of these changes. And the fact that in so many instances, you're kind of probably lucky that you didn't deal with this, but in a lot of those schools, they're essentially making up scores all the time so that they can put that on their resume too. So it's really, really a bad situation.
Oh, absolutely. A former, well, no, I'm still acquainted with her. She's still back in Chicago, and she's a reading specialist, and so she travels from school to school. And she kind of got in a lot of trouble because she at an open meeting mentioned the growth or lack of growth in reading, and the principal and the assistant principal were adamant that no, we don't talk about these things, because if you talk about a school where 92 or 93% of the student body still has a reading capacity of the 5th or 6th grade, you are shining a spotlight on an already disadvantaged group, and you're making them appear in a more negative light. And she was adamant that we have to be honest, and we have to be open and say, this is what actually exists right now. You are never going to have productive discussions about, okay, how do we build from here, until you address what actually exists. People don't want to hear. And I was not the most favored person amongst some of my colleagues, because I would point out, like, okay, yeah, these things that you're advocating, I agree with them. I'm on board, and most of us are. However, again, you can't just say, well, it's the second week of school. How do we get these kids up to standard? And it's like, you can't. But now there can be growth, but you're not going to get 5 years worth of growth in one school year. And if you said such things, and such things were said, you'd get screamed down. You don't believe in the children. All this gaslighting. Well, obviously, you're not here to help. Stuff like that. It's like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't help these people, but again, it's magical thinking. If you actually believe that you could just sort of wave a magic wand and boom, 5 years worth of reading growth has been attained in 1 year. There was her principal said, well, we're gonna have to invest more time and effort, and that's how we'll get them caught up. And the teachers were just looking around saying, like, that's not possible. And the principal said, I'm here to make it possible. So when she told me this story, I just laughed, and I said to her, Matt, do you know what magical thinking is? And she's like, I think I know what you're referencing. I'm like, yeah, just because I say something isn't going to happen in 1 year doesn't mean I don't believe it can't ever happen, but your comment about, like, there are certain taboo subjects that you're not supposed to bring up. There is a culture of not putting the full light onto those, and so that they can be discussed openly, because they are very embarrassing. I mean, if you look at the complete lack of opportunity and equity that exists in this country, because schools are funded on tax dollars. So schools that serve poor communities will have fewer resources. I'm one of the biggest advocates saying, if you have a classroom of children who have all of these additional socioeconomic needs, the classroom should be capped at 12 to 15 students. There should be smaller class sizes so that you can give each kid more attention. But we're so obsessed with standardized testing, and yet we're also standardizing, like, the number in a classroom, and I just love, like, we differentiate your teaching, differentiate the curriculum. Why don't you differentiate the funding? Why don't you differentiate the testing, so that we could test these kids' growth at this area, as opposed to, like, well, are they able to pass the SAT yet? So there is most definitely a culture of silence, and a culture of no, we're not going to openly address that, because I think that would scare some people away from trying to achieve the more ideal objectives. They might see it as, like, this isn't going to happen. I'm of the opinion that you have to be brutally honest and brutally pragmatic before you are aggressively idealistic.
Yeah, for sure. So many things came to mind when you were talking. One was an interview that I went to, and essentially the principal really liked me, so he told me the right answer that I missed in the interview. But one of the questions was, why are there, lower test scores and lower, just lower performance in this particular neighborhood? And so I mentioned things like, maybe a lack of two-parent households, parents are working, kids are stressed out, just kind of like the basic things, there's maybe poverty, maybe not a huge focus on education, just a lot of the things. And he told me later in the interview that that answer was wrong, that the reason that these kids are not performing well is teachers' implicit bias and racism toward the students. And it's kind of ironic because a lot of the teachers were teachers of color to begin with. And so there is a huge, I think, culture too of like blaming the teachers for why the students aren't succeeding. And I've kind of made the mistake a few times of just kind of innocently commenting after like parent teacher conferences or something that, it does seem that maybe education is not a huge priority with a lot of our parents. And oh my gosh, I just got filleted for saying that, just for making an observation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a moral judgment. It could be because there's other more pressing issues on their mind, or it could be, like you mentioned way earlier in the interview, their background wasn't great with education and they had a bad experience. There's so many reasons why these things could be happening, but I definitely have seen that issue. And the biggest one that I saw in education was we basically could not talk about bad behavior publicly in district meetings, in trainings, like nothing, because the implication is if most of the students are students of color and you're saying there's behavioral problems, then again, it goes back to, well, that must mean that you're racist. That must mean that you don't understand the children's cultural expression. That must mean that you have some kind of hidden thought process that makes you think that a certain standard of behavior is, better. Just absolute insanity. And so circling way back to the thing you were saying at the beginning, where, you can't have students grow 5 reading levels in 1 year, I would say unless that student is willing to maybe work 3 hours a night additionally on homework, on reading, because I have seen actually some outrageous growth. The few years that administrators left me alone for different reasons, we would go through maybe 12 to 14 full-length novels a year. I mean, the kids just read and read, and we discussed and we wrote and we did all the great things. And I would see massive growth in reading scores. But as soon as I would move to like either another administrator would come in or I'd move to another district, I was told, oh, you can't do that. That's old school. You can't use novels. You can't read full text. You can't expect kids to do homework. So it's like they're shooting themselves in the foot perpetually. They're saying that they have these Pollyanna expectations that they're looking for, but then we're not allowed to talk about where the kids are starting from. We're not allowed to talk about the problems that the kids might be having. We're not allowed to address student behavior or motivation or priorities. And so I think the only thing that gets left in these scenarios is for teachers to essentially cheat and make up scores. Like that's all that's left, because it's like the stuff's not going to happen, like you said, magically with just somebody up there, kind of juggling fiery bowling pins. Like that's not going to get the kids' reading scores up.
Well, and if you go on YouTube and just do a brief search of like college students who can't read, there was I think it was the Washington Post, the New York Times did a piece about 2 weeks ago, and increasingly there are kids getting into colleges that they can't read an entire book. They can barely read a magazine article because, oh, textbooks, that's the 20th century. Oh, reading an entire book, why do they need to do that? And we have most definitely watered down the standards. I'm not going to put the entire blame on the schools, social media, and addiction to iPhones. Now that is an entire separate video that you and I could do. I have some interesting stories there as well, but there is falsification of information. Universities / colleges should be more skeptical of the students coming out of high schools, because some teachers and administrators are just afraid of the parents. They don't want to deal with them. So it's sort of like, oh, whatever, the kid has a B, I'll just give him an A to get him out of my hair, so that they're not, coming to me, sending one email after the other. And again, if the folks watching this video care to opine, put in the comments, like, have you ever felt forced to falsify information for the sake of maintaining your job, whatever? Something that I want to go back to and touch on that ties in with magical thinking is that, schools cannot be expected. This was something that came up in my student teaching class. Schools cannot just be accepted to fill in every feasible gap that comes up. And, in communities with greater need, we have seen like a collapse of community. If you go back 100 years, and you look at how an individual interacted with those around them, think about it. People were involved in church or other religious groups. People have clubs. People were employed where you knew your fellow employees very well, and maybe you socialized with them. People were more neighborly. Over the last 100 years, the sense of community has really broken down. And even parenting. Parents used to do more. Parents used to be more engaged in the raising of their kids. And with each generation that has gone by, you hear, a policy expert saying, well, this isn't happening in the homes anymore. This isn't happening in the community anymore. And so consequently, the school needs to fill that gap. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't need out there, but think about all of the things that used to be done by community organizations, the voluntary organizations, and they're not happening anymore. This relates to why more and more people are feeling lonely. They aren't associating with other people in the ways they used to. But every time there's like a collapse of communal feeling or communal interactions, it's like, well, the school can now fill it. And, I remember when they brought in like a free breakfast for everyone. They just said, well, an increasing number of kids aren't eating in the morning. And because the mom isn't there or there isn't food, or I never had a problem with that. But in the last several years that I was teaching high school, the school brought in like, additional social emotional counselors on top of the counselors we already had, on top of the dean of students and all these other things. And it's like, well, the principal explained, well, the kids need this because the parents can't provide anymore, and they don't have things in their community to go do. So now we have to fill that gap. And it's like, if you're going to ask the schools to take on more and more responsibilities, you're going to have to hire more people, which means you're going to have to raise taxes. And if there's one thing Americans can't stand, it's paying taxes. So, but the magical thinking in here is that, of course, the schools can, accomplish this thing. The school will be, I remember telling a colleague, like, I can't be the teacher and the therapist and the counselor and the friend and the neighbor. And we talk about wearing many hats, but you're asking us to wear all the hats. At a certain point, we need to say, like, what? We're not saying that this need doesn't exist, but the school by itself can't meet it. This needs to happen in the home. This needs to happen in the community. And I don't have the answer for that, because poor communities have far greater need. More people are traumatized by poverty. More people have PTSD. So those communities need services. So, of course, they're going to be more hampered to help their own children. But the school by itself can't be expected to be the skeleton key that will open every single door. By expecting schools to be everything to everyone, you are destroying schools as an institution, and you're destroying the people that are there to provide a service, because you keep asking them to do more and more and more, and you keep expecting them to perform more and more miracles. And what's super ironic is that the school likes to think of itself as like a miracle creator, almost like a religious institution, that we're going to save the world. We're going to, the sort of savior mentality. And what was super ironic is that the people who are being served don't view the school in the same way that a follower would view a Messiah, So there's that weird dichotomy there where it's like, we want you to perform miracles, but we greatly disrespect you. And there's no way we ever see you as a Messiah. It's so weird. I don't have a full explanation for it, but yeah, we going back to the honest discussions, we need to start saying to ourselves and saying to the public, listen, we just can't do it. This is not something that we on ourselves can accomplish. We should encourage community organizations and community efforts. Of course, that isn't going to be a sure fix for it either. And again, I'm not offering here any definitive answers, but something that is definitive is that the schools are collapsing under the strain and the pressure over a prolonged period of time. And if we're going to save public education, we need to pivot towards sort of a more pragmatic and realist set of expectations and discussions with the public. We have to be more honest. We have to be able to say, listen, your child has a 5th grade reading level. We have 2 years until graduation. Here's what we want to try to accomplish. But, maybe here's some resources that could continue gaining on the outside. Because for what you described in your example of like making incredible gains, would you agree with me that those were probably more exceptional compared to the norm as opposed to like typical? You sometimes see like in some of these education movies where like what is the one in Los Angeles where the math teacher does this amazing job with all the kids and he gets them to learn calculus? And
I can't remember the name.
Saying, do you remember the name?
No, I don't remember the name.
Okay. But you sometimes see these films where like the teacher performs miracles and people are like, why can't my kid's teacher do that? And it's like, because that's exceptional. And by the way, it's Hollywood, which means they've dressed it up. And there's a lot of magic going on when Hollywood gets involved. And people think like that every teacher should be able to accomplish those things, It's like, I'm sorry that the real world is not as fantastical and a bit plain and more disappointing than you might want to believe.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I've never really thought about it. I do think, and I'm, going to sound super obnoxious by saying this, I think I had the potential to be one of those unicorn teachers, but I got completely just devastated by the control and the pressure and having my hands tied. I think truly if they would have left me alone, I probably could have consistently showed massive growth, because like reading has always been my passion. It's something that I love. It's something that I think that I was really excellent at teaching, but I just kind of like wilted like a sad flower when I was told, no, you can't do any of those things. You have to have this awful, computer curriculum. And, I sound like a broken record, but just being told you can't have any standards for them. If they turn in nothing all year, if they essentially would have had the equivalent of a 10% in the grade book, but they just pass anyway. Those were more of the issues that I was dealing with, in the kind of schools that I was in. It would be interesting, not that I don't think I would do this at this point, but it would be interesting if I taught more of like a magnet school that had really motivated kids that worked hard and that were excited about that kind of thing. But really what I found is when I had really high expectations truly for the kids and they saw my passion and that I was there for them and that I provided the framework for them to flourish, they did really well. It was more everybody on the outside saying that's too much. They shouldn't have to do that. You're being too hard on them. Because I would try to have consequences when they didn't turn in assignments, when they, didn't do their homework. And I was just constantly being told at every turn, no, like you can't expect that. I was told, oh, your novels by C.S. Lewis is by like an old dead white guy. You need to get rid of that altogether. Even though even my kids that were boys loved the books, which can be hard finding, literature that boys and girls like, they loved it, but I was just being told and boxed in at every corner, being told you can't do that. It's not the right thing. And I'm thinking I'm getting results and you're telling me it's not the right thing. And so it was very frustrating for sure.
The problem amongst some educators is that they want to save the world. They believe that a perfected future is attainable. Okay. And this sort of becomes almost like a religious mindset and I had several people I worked with who had this like white savior mentality of like, I need to save the children. And I told one of them like, what you have said and what you are doing is a little disgusting to me, because you've just objectified Black children because you say they can't save themselves, so I will save them. And it's like, who the hell are you to save anyone? You can help people out, but are you implying that they are totally incapable without you? Because it would feed back, and I mean she would feel super important about herself when something would get done. And but there are that personality type who I think go into education. They want to save the world. I am not opposed to making the world a better place. Okay, but again, you have to temper the sort of emotional idealism with that rational pragmatism. Be like, well, if this is what we want to do, then how do we build our way there? I saw a former colleague of mine who was teaching art, and we had a professional development day, and she broke down crying, talking about the growing inequity in Chicago and the growing problems being seen. She started screaming at everyone else in this meeting. 114 teachers were there. She's sitting there screaming at us, being like, the fact that this hasn't been fixed by now means that like all of you are complicit in it. We're like, what? You know? So but to add to that, I know that at the same time there was a time in this country where maybe education in some areas was more dominated by pessimistic realists. The type of person who would have said a child with Asperger's can't learn. In fact, a child with a learning disability shouldn't even be in the school. So that was a negative mindset and I'm glad we've moved away from that, because there were many people who were marginalized and just told, like, you're too stupid to be in school. You're incapable of learning. That's the other end of the extreme. Okay. And we've gone from one extreme in the 50s and 60s where it was, we didn't understand learning in the same way we do now, but we went from that extreme of like, shut up, sit in your desk, obey me, don't say a word, paddling, corporal punishment. We went from that extreme to the like, la la la. We can accomplish anything and everything. And if you suggest that we might not get everything done, then you don't believe in humanity. You don't believe in social justice. You don't believe in any of this. And we need to find a common ground in the middle. I'm a big lover and advocate of like, Zen Buddhism, sort of the yin and the yang, and the two coexist. So we somehow need to find a middle ground in this profession of how do we build towards a better world where kids have access to bettering themselves, access to skills, access to knowledge, but we also take into account that we live in a society hyper motivated by materialism and capitalism, and we still have existent inequity. That middle ground we're very far away from it. And I know colleges of ed say oh no, we've always been there, and I'm like, that I have not seen that, and I have not heard that either. I don't know. Did you feel like your student teaching experience? Well, you commented already, but do you feel like it was dominated by just sort of these like people who understand education not by practice but through theory, and in what they want to accomplish is less real and more ideal?
Oh, 100%. That's basically what Teach for America was, to be honest. And Teach for America is different in that they take somebody with any undergraduate degree that it doesn't even have to be education related. They give you a 5-week boot camp, and then they ship you into some of the most difficult schools in the United States with some of the greatest needs in the USA. And it's kind of like a division of AmeriCorps. So yeah, you have a lot of idealistic, hopeful hippies, and you also have some really like high driven people that want it to be on their resume because they want to be a lawyer, and they want that on their resume, because Teach for America used to be the thing to do. I feel like it's kind of fallen in popularity now, but when I was first applying back in 2013, I want to say they rejected over like 90% of applicants, and everybody wanted to get into it. But yeah, like the whole thing was essentially idealism. It was this idea that if you get really smart, really motivated, really passionate young people, regardless of if they studied like botany or like plant weaving basics, whatever they studied, it doesn't matter. It's this kind of magical person, and you just stick them in a classroom, and they're going to get, like you were saying, like 5 years of gains. And they were honest all the time about data. And it was like very elitist. It was all about putting down regular teachers that had been in the classroom for 30 years. And so for one of our experiences in the 5-week boot camp, we literally went into some random school and we started picking apart what the teachers were doing wrong when we were maybe in week 2 of our, training experience. And it was completely wild and crazy. It was very, very idealistic. And it was all based on the idea that like, hey, teacher, if you're willing to put in the 80 hours, you can achieve anything. And it was very much like very kind of basic, simplistic answers. Now, I would say back when I was in TFA, they were less, I don't even know what the right official word to say is, but they believed in high expectations. They believed in discipline and consequences and really having kids work hard. And I respect them for that. I have no idea with like the change of landscape in education, what it would be like in 2024, but there was a lot of idealism for sure.
So since you brought up the word elitism, let me share with you another experience I had with that principal, the one who, we need to have women soldiers on, Normandy Beach and, World War II. So another problem that I'm absolutely convinced exists within the profession is, and I'm not entirely certain if this is more inside or outside, but we need to purge ourselves of this mentality that going to a 4-year college after high school is the only measure of success. I had the opportunity through a Fulbright grant to go to Germany 5 years ago, and for 2 weeks we traveled around Germany. We visited university preparatory high schools, we visited vocational high schools, and in Germany, they place a very big emphasis on education being practical. So around the 9th or 10th grade, it's sort of like, do you think you might be more interested in like mechanics or engineering or something hands-on? And if that, and they sit down with the family, the student, the counselors, it's a big group. And if that decision is made, the kids goes to a vocational school, and they prepare them to have a job with like BMW or to be a certified electrician on day one when they graduate. In fact, their senior year, their equivalent of a senior year, is a paid internship. So we visited this paper factory, and we were talking with some high schoolers who were shadowing this electrician, and he was doing the rewiring for this giant paper factory that they were building outside of Munich. But here in the US, we've become so obsessed with like, oh, you have to go to a 4-year school. And if you want to be a mechanic or you want to be an electrician, you want to be a pipe fitter. I had an uncle who was a pipe fitter in Michigan. He made way more money than my parents did as educators. But, I look around me and it feels like we shame these people. These people make a meaningful contribution to our society. And then when you're in a discussion with them, it's like, oh, where'd you go to school after you graduated high school? Well, I went to a community college and I got my apprenticeship or whatever. Oh, what went wrong? We almost treat them like they failed. And so going into a vocation was like, well, I guess that's a good backup. So anyway, the principal brought me in because a student came to me and he said, I really loved your classes. I had him for 3 different classes. And, I'm doing well in all of them, but I know that I want to do something related to cars. He was very good with his hands. He loved creating things. And he said, there's a really good like 2-year training program through the City College of Chicago. And I really like working on engines and blah, blah, blah. And I wouldn't get that at a 4-year school. And he's like, also, I'm exhausted with being in a formal school setting like this. And I don't think I would be happy. I did a couple college visits. I don't feel it. And I said to him, you know what? That is a very mature and honest discussion that you've had with yourself. If you really feel that way, you know what? I support you. There are a lot of good paying jobs out there. He was also really afraid of going into debt. He was going to be the first in his family to go to college. His family's originally from Mexico. And I fully supported him on this. He went back to his counselor and said, you know what? I'm going to pursue the vocational program through the City College of Chicago. I don't want to apply to all these other schools. So the counselor immediately contacted the principal and said that I was talking students out of going to college. The principal exploded, as this person typically did, and over the intercom asked me to come to the front office. So of course everyone's like, oh, he's in trouble. I go down there and the principal immediately says, do you realize you have just derailed a student of color going to college? So the student being Hispanic. And I was like, okay, I know what she's talking about. Okay. And she sat there for like 4 minutes and it was just a stream of consciousness. I don't even remember her breathing. Like it was like, and she talked about that I couldn't foresee his potential or growth, maybe because of my white privilege. Did I understand that the school's rating system was partially based on the number of minority students who went off to a 4-year school and all these other things? So it was just like 4 minutes of just, it all came out. I'm like, uh-huh. So, and I said, well, hold on here. The student came to me because he was not comfortable having this discussion with the counselor because the counselor was so aggressive. For the record, the counselor was pressured by the principal to get as many minority kids going to a 4-year school because it would impact our rating within Chicago public schools. So that's a great example right there of like, you do not care about this child. You care about a statistic on a piece of paper that will come back to reflect you. Okay. So I told her, listen, this kid came to me. He trusted me. I have known him since he was a freshman. He's taken 3 of my AP classes, and he said, here is what he wants to do. He's passionate about it. He does, like, you know, anyway, long story short, I said all these things to her, and she wrote me up. It was a formal reprimand for, here's what she got me on. I stepped out of what my job description was. Nowhere in my job description does it say that I am to counsel students on like college or future potential professional employment, whatever. It was just a bunch of jingo she put right there. So say, well, you have acted unprofessionally by stepping out of your lane. If I remember correctly, that's exactly how she worded it. So it was a formal reprimand, the only reprimand I've ever had in 15 years. And I had to sign it. And it was so surreal. Like and I said to her, hold on here. So this kid is super excited about other things. You want him to go off to this 4-year school. And she kept saying, the jobs of the future are through a college education. Okay. This job that he might go into is going to be shipped to China. And I said, no, it will not be shipped to China, because someone is still going to need to be a mechanic, you know, fixing these cars, working on these things. And by the way, for the record, so he graduated in 2020. When the pandemic was going on. He's been out of high school for 4 years. He's now an assistant manager at a Honda dealership in Chicago, and he's making about $72,500 a year. He's very happy. He's saving up money. This is something a lot of 20-year-olds can't say. He's saving money up for a down payment on a home. It's going to take a while, but I've communicated with him. Because I had a Honda, and I didn't even know he worked at the dealership. I went in for an oil change. I'm like, oh my gosh, how's it going? What's going on? And he told me everything that's going on. He's happy as a girlfriend. So I see that as, you know what? I did a positive service to another human being. And if it cost me a formal write-up by a narcissistic administrator, so be it. Thus is the world.
Wow. That is a really powerful story. And I just think it encapsulates everything that we've been talking about. Teachers that truly are doing a great job, that are truly impacting the future of students, are penalized if they cross somebody wrong. There's so many big egos a lot of times in administration. And it's such a shame too that the counselor did that to you, like threw you under the bus like that. Did you ever repair the relationship with that counselor, or what was that like afterwards?
No, that counselor was another example of someone who had only taught for a year, and then they became a counselor. So I didn't even see it worth an effort to go and address the issue. The counselor was also very buddy with the entire administration. I'm like, that's just a non-starter. It wouldn't have been productive. But what's most important here, besides the fact that he's living well, he has a good paying job, he's doing what he enjoys. But what this demonstrates is that for some of these administrators and for some of these school systems, the students are objectified. They really are a number. They are a statistic. Okay. I blame the fact that the corporate business mindset has so deeply penetrated the thinking of educational administration. You hear administrators talking about measurable results and measurable growth and long-term targets. And you feel like you're hearing some floor manager at a Ford plant in Detroit talking about, well, we want to increase output by 6% within the next quarter. So how can we maximize labor and electricity and other things? And it's like, in those processes, you're talking about an inanimate object. It's an automobile. We're talking about human beings here. So, again, there's so much to discuss. You can't do it in a short hour-long video. But so if you were to ask me, maybe we could discuss this next, what are the things that I've seen change most? One of the major things is that in 15 years, administration has become more corporate. They are so heavily focused on just data, but the methods of gathering that data are horribly flawed. So I never trusted the data. And the people who are supposed to be running these systems are less and less qualified. So how could you not talk about like the collapse of American public education by only looking at the crazy bulldozer parents and the apathetic kids? We have plenty of internal soul searching within the profession that we have to do. We have to be able to admit there is such a thing as a non-effective teacher, just as there's such a thing as a non-effective cop who commits police brutality, just as there is a non-effective doctor who should never be allowed to do surgery. There is such a thing as a non-effective teacher. I don't believe most teachers are non-effective. And you also have non-effective administrators. Unfortunately, it appears it's quite easy for a non-effective teacher to work their way upwards to then become a non-effective administrator. Imagine that. You have an administrator who couldn't cut it in the classroom, and now they can't cut it in the front office. And so they're making it doubly miserable for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I think we really covered a lot. And so I'm just curious, what do you wish the public knew about a teacher's job? Just the random person that's not initiated in things that are going on in education. What do you wish people understood about this whole conversation?
I'll end it with going back to magical thinking. So parents and the community need to understand that like the teacher is a human being. They can't accomplish everything in the classroom for every single child. Right now we differentiated curriculum or differentiated teaching, whatever they want to call it. You now have parents believing like, well, my kid has a distinct learning type or learning preference or whatever. So the teacher should adjust whatever they're doing to meet my specific kid's needs. That is not realistic. Okay. If you, I wanted to say this to so many parents, but I dared not because I was never sure what would actually happen. But I wanted to tell parents, listen, if you really want your child to succeed, it takes more than what happens in the classroom. It's more than me in the classroom. It's your kid and you working with your kid. Okay. It's a relationship. Again, it's like going back to community. When we talk about why is it that some kids are more successful than others? Well, if you have a mom or dad that is reading to a kid from a very early age, you've just given them a competitive advantage. Okay. I'm not one of those people who believe that like, oh, if you just spend more money within a school district, you'll get more results. There's a lot of advantages that some kids have from very early on that schools just they can't compete with. So if a parent really wanted to understand like how can my kid do better, you as the parent are a fundamental table leg of holding that table up. You reading to your kid, knowing what's going on. Now that doesn't mean being a helicopter parent, but you letting your kid sit on an iPad or on their phone for 8 to 10 hours a day and not interacting with them, that's not helping them. Okay. The teacher is not a miracle worker. Okay. I know that there was some documentary called Waiting for Superman. If you've ever heard of that, What an absurd idea that the teacher is Superman. Superman, it doesn't exist. And we have to be more realistic. A teacher needs to be able to say to parents, I can't do this on my own. I have 29 other kids here in the classroom. Here's what you can do at home. Okay. But a lot of teachers are afraid to say that because then the teacher might be accused of being, well, they're not qualified for the job, but they're incompetent, or the administrator might step in and be like, well, I'm hearing that you're not able to accommodate this particular child's needs, or you're not willing to do this, or you're not excited to do that. And it's like, the student success is so rooted above and beyond just the classroom and the teacher. It goes back to the community. It goes back to the home. And if we really want to see a turning around of things, we need to have that discussion about like, hey, what are we asking schools to do, or what are we expecting of them that is just not realistic? Okay. That doesn't mean we don't believe the need isn't there, but we have to say, you know what, some other institution or body or group or whatever needs to fill that need, because we're asking everything of the schools, and it's destroying the schools.
I totally agree with that. That's really well stated. And I would just add to that, it sounds kind of terrible, but you can't force somebody to have something that they don't want. I think that's the really sad truth about modern education. And it's across, America. It's not just low socioeconomic status. It's not just minority kids. It's like there's been a real huge decrease in people's passion and value and love for education. And so schools are trying to single-handedly not only give kids an education, but give them the value and the desire to have an education. If they're coming in without that, then it's nigh unto impossible for us to do the things that we're being asked to do. So I think that's another big, society and culture question for America and other countries that are in the same boat. So this has been so awesome, Mr. G. I'm just curious. I love to ask people this question. If you had a magic wand and you could change anything in education, what would it be?
I've thought about this for years. And I'm going to reference my experience in Germany again. We need to bring back tangible value to a high school education. I think if you were to ask most people right now, so what is the value of a high school diploma? I don't think most people would say, oh yeah, that's something of value. It's sort of, they take it for granted. They see it as just a stepping stone to getting into college. We don't differ, we talk about differentiating curriculum, but we don't differentiate educational options at the K-12 level. What I would like to see is us looking more at Germany and Japan, where they have that vocational option, and they say, you can start specializing and focusing on more specific things earlier on. Now in Germany, they do it in the 8th and 9th grade. That's a bit young. I would advocate that in the sophomore year, there's this sit down and we look at like, okay, are you interested in going off to college? Are you interested in something more vocational? And the last 2 years of a high school education would be more specialized. I brought this up when I was doing my student teaching, and the ideologues in the colleges of ed were like, that's not the American way. The American way is that the schools build everyone towards a more democratic, common experience. But that, again, that exists in a fantasy world. We need to have outcomes that are more practical. We have way too many kids going to college right now and taking out way too much debt. We have burdened an entire generation with trillions of dollars of debt. And a lot of these kids would have been happier, and they suspected like, I might actually want to do this. We could have had some of these kids going off and going into construction, going into automotive repair, whatever. There is nothing shameful about these options. I will say it again. These are important members of society. They fulfill an important function. They make an important contribution. We need to stop. We need to get our heads out of our you-know-what and stop thinking about a 4-year college as the only honorable option. So I'd like to see us pivot towards a model where within a school district, you might have like, well, here's the vocational school. Maybe several school districts would share a vocational school, and you start giving more options or letting kids specialize in high school. If you were to ask a lot of either teachers or parents or students, so what is the value of a high school diploma? I don't see it there. Now I know what the value of it is, and you know what the value of it is, but it's become abstract. We've watered it down. And we need to give it more tangible meaning. We need to look at what have other countries done that is successful. The fact that my principal only cared about that kid going to a 4-year school because he was a statistic, that's obviously the problem. But if he had gone to the 4-year school, he probably would have left after a couple of years. He would have taken on a lot of debt, and then he'd be miserable. And then he would spend the next 20 years possibly paying that debt off. What good would that have been? So if I could wave my magic wand, we start looking at what are they doing in other countries. And by the way, a couple states, I think like Tennessee and South Carolina, are starting to do this. So they're starting to say, we need to differentiate our educational settings as much as we're talking about differentiating teaching in curriculum. That's what I would really like to see.
I love that idea, Mr. G. Very, very awesome. And thank you so much, by the way, for sharing your experiences and being so honest. Audience, thank you for watching. If you would like to interview with me, feel free to email me at teachertherapytrish@gmail.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.